The problem with calling a super cycle is it implies that everything is going to remain globalized, and I don't think that's the case. And as the world breaks up into economic blocks, you're going to have different market patterns for each commodity based on where they're sourced and where they're needed. So
Okay.
in the case of the Western Hemisphere, which is probably going to be more or less one block, this is where most of the world's copper comes from, with Chile, to a lesser degree Bolivia, and then the United States and Canada being the big players. So when you're talking about the world needing to triple the amount of copper, we can't do that. But if all the major copper producers are in one block, then all of a sudden it becomes very doable because we don't need to triple it. We just take the parts that we're going to the rest of the world and we use them locally. That works here. It probably will with lithium as well. All the cobalt's in Congo. There's no way to make that work. Most of the nickel's in Russia. Oh my God, now we're talking about doing a neo-colonial war into Siberia in order to keep the nickel flowing? Oh! So you break up the markets, and the very concept of a super cycle doesn't mean the same thing.
Yeah.
Like if we get into a world in the next few months where, like, say the Swedes actually drop the information they've got and the Europeans just completely stop all oil and natural gas that is flowing west from Russia. I'm not just saying stop using, stop the flows, because that's where this leads. Energy prices globally skyrocket. And then the Biden administration is going to have to make some interesting choices. In existing American law, the American president can shut off oil exports with a flick of a pen. Does not require Congress. So we could see the world losing Russian oil and American oil at the same time. And in that sort of scenario, you easily get a global price that goes above 150 or even 200. And you easily get a price in the United States that drops below 70 and never rises past 70 again. Again, we're not in a single market anymore, and commodities have yet to reflect that.
Mm.
From a global point of view, a global recession is already hardwired in. The IMF actually expects the lowest growth that we have seen since at least the 1980s for the next decade. That it does not take into account demographic decay. That does not take into account a Russia war that goes to its logical conclusion one way or another. So the best case scenario for the world as a whole is roughly 0% growth for the next 10 years. It does not take a lot to take a 0% growth story into recessionary territory. We all need to just kind of pencil that in. But 0 or below on average is not the same as 0 everywhere. In the case of the United States, we need to double the size of the industrial plant. That's highly inflationary, but that's a massive growth story. Yeah, well, one of the things to keep in mind is as the baby boomers are leaving the market because they're all retiring and cashing in their investments, in a couple of years, we're going to be in an environment where if you have capital, that's going to be very valuable. And we're nearing an interesting entry point into the financial markets that can maintain liquidity. I don't consider myself even a quasi-expert in that category. The problem is that so many of them have industrial uses in addition, and in the green transition and a lot of this retooling of manufacturing that we have to do on a global basis anyway, a lot of them have a lot of needs. So that is very bullish for them, independent of what anyone might consider in terms of using them as a hedge against inflation or as a financial asset in its own right. And that makes them all wildly volatile. And then, of course, you have to look at where they come from. If you're looking at platinum, you're talking South Africa. That's probably okay. If you're looking at palladium, you're talking northern Russia, and that's probably not. I don't want to give you a price forecast because I don't have one. All I can tell you is that the majority of the world's copper does come from the Western Hemisphere, and I don't see a security reason why the supply should be interrupted. Now, the growth story for copper until now has been hand in hand with globalization, and that's why China has been the world's largest absorber of copper for decades. I think that's going to stop cold. But if we are going to electrify everything, that's technically a bigger demand story. Coal in the United States is in the process of being phased out because the natural gas that comes out of the shale fields is primarily now a waste product, and it just can't compete on price. But if you break down global trade, one of the things that people forget is in terms of international energy patterns, oil and natural gas, those are the low carbon fuels, and they're internationally traded. So you break that down, and most countries have to go back to something they can get locally, which is coal, which is exactly what the Germans are doing today. The world's single largest producer and exporter of fertilizers of all types is Russia. And specifically, nitrogen fertilizers are a subset of natural gas, or produced from natural gas. So as Russian energy falters, you should expect that to go away as well. And roughly half of the world's potash comes from Belarus and Russia specifically, at some very specific sites that are having some technical problems because of labor issues. The other one is phosphate. Phosphate, single largest source, comes from China, but the Chinese have been restricting exports because they're now experiencing a nationwide outbreak of not mad cow, the other one, African swine fever, which is decimating their pork herds again. And phosphate is used for rice production. So for food security reasons, do not expect the Chinese to allow phosphate back onto the market. So we haven't hit it yet, thank God, but we are kind of seeing this building perfect storm where all three nutrients are available in lower volumes even before we have to deal with the effects of deglobalization. And if you're in a country like, say, Brazil, where you import 90% of your fertilizer and 3/4 of that comes from Russia, you're looking at a pretty problematic future in the not too distant future. I'm also a little concerned about South Asia, which also imports a lot of their fertilizers from this space. Sub-Saharan Africa, it's kind of a mix of the food and the fertilizer. And oh yeah, we're going to lose Ukraine probably this year as a significant agricultural exporter, because the Russians are going to torpedo the grain deal very soon, and then only about 10 to 15% of Ukraine's grains can actually get railed out, and that might even be too optimistic. We are definitely not out of the woods. So first, the good. Mother Nature was very kind last year, and we had great weather in every agricultural zone in the world. That had never happened before. It may never happen again. So good for what it is. Second, everyone had a bit of a reserve of fertilizer. And of all the sanctions and boycotts that have hit the Russian space so far, a lot of them had specific carve-outs for fertilizer and fertilizer inputs. And you even had the U.S. Department of Commerce issuing letters of comfort to shippers and buyers saying that Russian stuff is expressly exempted from all of the sanctions. And that kept some of the stuff flowing in a way that it wouldn't have otherwise. Now that we're a year on, we're seeing damage to that infrastructure, damage to that production capacity in the former Soviet Union. We'll never have that kind of weather again. But we do have a number of countries, Nigeria, Canada, Morocco, who have accelerated their plans to increase fertilizer output. In the United States, for nitrogen, we're doing the same thing. It's not enough. It's not fast enough. It can't be fast enough. Some of these things take 10 years to bring online. But the fact that people have seen the writing on the wall and are doing everything they can to increase supply while they can is a good sign. And every day that this stuff doesn't fall off in Ukraine and Russia is a day we have to try to bring on replacement supplies. One of the things that the Europeans absolutely got right about the sanctions regime is it's not about stopping the war. It's about cutting Russia out of the system at a pace that allows the rest of the world to adjust. Now, we're not done. We're not done by a long shot. But the fact that the world's largest commodities supplier is getting steadily gutted and we haven't had a commodity shock, we're living on borrowed time, but it's been a pretty good year, all things considered. Well, one of the things the German government is doing is coming up with a combination of retraining and subsidies programs to try to help with the industrial transition. So when this stuff really does all go away, you're not completely caught with your pants down like we were a year and a half ago. That can always go faster. It can always be more realistic, but the fact that it's happening at all, I think, is a great sign. In the United States, the thing that would help the most is building out processing capacity for any and all of the materials that are going to be necessary as we lose Russian and Chinese supplies. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is a stupid name for what it actually does, is actually our first step in that direction since the 1940s. And so it's inefficient and it's overly expensive and it's sloppy. But for the first time we've done it, it's not bad. People are pricing in, or at least thinking about what's going on in the Russian space and where that leads. We are not seeing the same degree of forethought in the Chinese space. Now, yes, between COVID and Trump and now Biden, companies have come to the conclusion that China as a supplier of goods to the world is probably never going to regain the heights that they had. And most American investment specifically into the Chinese space today is about servicing the Chinese market. Most of that's going to be lost. And the sooner that we can start the adjustment to whatever's after China, the better. And as the Europeans have shown us, if you take steps early, you can reduce the shock. Where I'm not seeing a sufficient amount of preparation in China or among investors in China to get ready for that. So I think it's very likely that when China does go down, we're going to lose their processed materials and especially their electronics manufacturer more or less at the same time. And that's going to hurt like hell for everyone because that capacity just doesn't exist anywhere else.